Turn with me to Philippians 4. So I'm going to read through these first two scriptures, and we'll focus on them, and we'll try and bring out what I think the authors are trying to tell us and how we can apply that to our lives today. Okay, so Philippians 4, verses 4 to 6. Philippians 4, verses 4 to 6. And keep a little tab there, because we'll be going back to there at some point, quite often, I think. So Philippians 4, verses 6 to 7, Paul has this to say. He says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." So that's what Paul has to say in Philippians. Now turn with me to 1 Peter 5. 1 Peter 5, also verses 6 and 7. 1 Peter 5, verses 6 and 7. Peter has this to say. "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you." But both of these men were apostles taught by Jesus, and they're echoing the same theme that Jesus himself thought he needed to expound upon in Matthew 6. Matthew 6, I'm not going to turn there, I'm not going to read it, but you, as a cross-reference, Jesus goes into the same theme of not being anxious. And if you're looking for a title for this sermon, it's "Do Not Be Anxious" in Matthew 6, and he covers this from verse 25 to 34. So just you can look that up on your own later. But Peter and Paul here are kind of echoing this theme that Jesus is talking about. Now, the words in 1 Peter and Philippians are basically the same words that Jesus uses for worry. It's the same Greek word, and so they're using, when Jesus says worry, it's the same word that Peter and Paul use here for anxious. So anxiety and worry are basically the same idea. The context of both of these letters is similar. One is to a specific church and one is to many churches, but these churches are both primarily Gentile churches, and they're churches that were built by Paul and Peter as they went out into the greater world, out from Jerusalem. Peter and Paul likely wrote both of these letters around 62 or 63 AD. So that's the time frame of the writing. So Nero is in charge. Paul would soon be killed, just shortly after writing Philippians, and Peter would be killed shortly thereafter. So shortly after Paul's murder, Peter is also killed. Both groups being addressed at the time of the writing were under persecution by Roman authorities. So these churches that Peter and Paul are writing to are under persecution by Rome. And we know that this is just the beginning. So in 62 and 63 AD, when these letters are written, we know that this is just the beginning of the persecution that happens, because we know through history and the writings of John and other historical characters such as Polycarp, who actually specifically addresses the church in Philippi later on in one of his letters. And in that letter, he specifically addresses the fact that they're being persecuted by the Romans. So we know that this is the beginning of the persecution, and that they're going to be persecuted for decades thereafter. Now, sometimes we think these people are different than us in many ways, and they are different than us in many ways, but in other ways they're quite similar. They would have been regular people that would have experienced the usual stresses of everyday life, if not more so than us. They would have experienced these stresses, the things that we call stresses that cause us anxiety. They would have been familiar with these topics that we have in our lives, these things that we have in our lives, such as a rebellious child that won't straighten out their ways. I left mine at home. No, Jack's actually at church in Kitchener. But you know, a rebellious child, they would have been, having some of those anxieties. They would have had the loss of loved ones. In fact, probably more than us back then. Death would have been a more familiar refrain in their life. Serious illness in the family, they would have known that. They would have had the strain of looking out for their elder parents more than we would, as for that matter, because they didn't have retirement homes to send them to. They would have had to look after them themselves. They may have experienced the stress that goes on with wondering whether or not their business plan would be successful, whether or not their business was going to succeed or not because of what was going on in their area. They would have had the threat of war from time to time. Again, that would have been an anxiety that would have been common for them. Maybe they would have had specific worries, like those are generalized worries, but sometimes it would have been something more specific, like if you're my daughter, she's constantly on edge that a spider might drop from the ceiling and land on her shoulder. That is an anxiety that she carries with her. If you're my son, you would have the anxiety that somebody might actually play with the Lego that you built, as opposed to leaving it alone and looking at it as a piece of art like it's supposed to be, right? So those are the things that might make you anxious that are specific to you. They would have had some of those specific anxieties as well. Some might experience the anxiety of coming up to lead songs. Dave, of course, is impervious to that kind of stress, but some of us would be anxious if we came up here and did that. There could be the stress of chronic pain or illness. You may wonder, is that lump just a cyst or is it cancer? Those type of things. Maybe it's relationship stresses. They would have experienced those as well. The anxiety of trying to find a suitable mate, and then once you found that mate, the anxiety of dealing with the underwear and socks thrown underneath the corner of the room's table. You might have stresses with friendships. They would have had those as well. Maybe you have a friend that cheers, for Satan's team, the New York Yankees, instead of cheering for God's team, the Toronto Blue Jays. How do you deal with that type of person? All these things that they would have been familiar to them are also familiar to us. These are things that they would have had in their lives, what we call normal stresses of life. They would have had those things. But on top of that, they would have had some other burdens. At this point in time, the Jewish community has now come to hate them and basically will rat them out to the Roman authorities whenever they could. And of course, there is that little detail of the Roman Empire with an emperor who in the near future was intent on either killing, maiming, or imprisoning these people. So they had those stresses on top of the normal everyday stresses. So these are the people that Peter and Paul are writing to. This is the type of people that had normal everyday stresses, but on top of that, they would have had more overreaching stresses, such as the threat of the Roman Empire and the Jewish community going after them. And we know that in short order, from Revelation, John's going to write to some of these people, that they're going to experience severe trials, the same type of trials that the churches in Revelation were to experience. And when we talk about anxiety and worry, we often use it interchangeably with fear. But anxiety is a little bit different than that. It's a sense of concern, warranted or unwarranted, about something that might happen to you based on your circumstances. Something that is, but it's future driven. It's something that you have anxiety about, something that might happen in the future. It's a sense of dread about what is about to happen in the future, not what's happening to you at that point in time. So things are in your life now causing you anxiety because you're worried about what that means about the future. And so this worry or anxiety can take over your life. It's something that you can think about all the time. Arthur Summers Roach says this: anxiety is a little stream of fear trickling through the mind that, if encouraged, cuts a deep channel into which all other thoughts are drained. So the idea is that this little trickle of fear that's running through your mind that you're concerned about can cause you so much concern that it becomes this thing to which everything else is drawn into. So you can't think about anything else in your world without also considering this anxiety in your life. Another quote which I like, which is from the famous philosopher named Anonymous, is, "Anxiety is like a toddler. It never stops talking. It tells you you're wrong about everything, and it wakes you up at 3 a.m. And that's something that often if you wake up at night and suddenly your mind starts thinking about the things that have happened, and you think, well, what if this happens or what if that happens, and you become anxious, you can't fall asleep, and then you're up until 5 a.m. and you finally fall asleep and you wake up exhausted in the morning. Some statistics that tell us this problem is getting worse in our society. I'll provide you with some statistics. In 2024, 43, and I don't have Canadian statistics, but I have American, UK statistics. I'm assuming they'll be quite similar. 43% of Americans said that they were more anxious in 2024 than they were the year before, which is up from 37% in 2023. So in 2023, 37% of the population said they were more anxious in 2023 than in 2022, which was a rise again from the year before that. On average, 1 in 5 American adults experience some form of anxiety disorder. So that's 2 out of 10 experience some form of anxiety disorder, which is a diagnosable condition, right? This is a diagnosable condition. In the UK, the numbers are slightly higher. It's about 22%, so just over 2 in 10, or just over 1 in 5. experience some sort of anxiety disorder. Teenagers and young adults have been especially hit by this increase of anxiety. This has coincided with the advent of social media and just the overall increase in media saturation. When I was a kid, you had to wait till 6 o'clock to get the news. Now you put on CNN or Fox News and you get or CBC, you get the news all day long, 24/7. And then on top of that, there's social media where kids are being bombarded with these events all the time. And it's almost exclusively, it is rarely a uplifting story. It's almost exclusively negative information. To give you some idea what this has done to the younger generation, Jonathan Haidt, I don't know if you know who Jonathan Haidt is, he wrote The Coddling of the American Mind. That was his most famous book, but he wrote a second book after that. He's a professor at New York University. He's a sociologist, and the last book he put out is called The Anxious Generation, The Anxious Generation. And it relays some stark statistics. In 2010, since 2010, undergraduate students in the United States have seen an increase of 134% in anxiety. So there's a 134% increase in anxiety amongst university students. There's a 106% increase in depression. This is since 2010, just basically after the iPhone became popular and we have social media. So there's a 106% increase in depression, a 72% increase in ADHD, and a 100% increase in anorexia, which is often a symptom of depression or anxiety. On top of that, there has been significant increases in anxiety prescriptions over the last 20 years. So especially in the most common people now getting prescribed this, and I see this in my own office, is younger people between the age of 18 and 35. So we've seen an increase in all these anxiety, depression, and other symptoms, and we've also seen an increase in medication. And so this is happening because we are bombarded with every natural man-made disaster that occurs. So before, in olden days, if something happened over in, was the last Santorini, they just had a big earthquake, and there's a whole bunch of earthquakes happening there, and they're talking about a tsunami coming to hit Israel. You wouldn't have found out about that until it happened. Like if there was a tsunami, you wouldn't have found out about that for months, right? So this is not something that's front of mind. It would have been old news. Now you get that information in real time, all the time, every day of the week. And usually what you do is you hear it from multiple sides. Nowadays you hear it from multiple sides of the political spectrum, and they usually disagree on just about every aspect of what's happened, and they disagree on who to blame about what's happening, but they definitely agree that whatever's happening is a disaster. The cause is somebody else's fault, but what's happening is a disaster, and whether that be you can discuss whatever the topic is. It can be climate to economy to the school system to the price of gas to anything you want to talk about. It's all a disaster, and what's going to happen in the future, what they'll tell you is what's going to happen in the future is definitely going to be worse if the other side, whoever the other side is in charge. So what has happened is a disaster, and it's only going to get worse unless, we're in charge. And so this is overwhelming. This is happening to us over and over and over again. It's becoming overwhelming. And the other thing is it all is seemingly out of our control. So that's the other thing. A lot of these things now we feel like they're out of our control. And so that is a problem for us as well. And so now you may look around the world and you may feel like it's coming apart. You may look around the world and see the institutions that you've taken for granted are falling apart. The stability of the government and the institutions that we have come to depend on are looking like they're coming undone. The moral fiber of society looks like it's coming undone. The norms we've taken for granted seem to be flipped on their heads. And all this change can give us cause for anxiety. All these things can be causes for anxiety. It may feel like we're living or coming to the time that Paul describes in 2 Timothy. So if you turn with me to 2 Timothy verse 3, 2 Timothy verse 3, you may feel like this is happening. 2 Timothy 3, and we're going to read verses 1 to 5 and also verse 7. 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 to 5 and verse 7. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. And from such people turn away. In verse 7, he sums it up here. Always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of truth. So we might feel like that description doesn't feel too far off of what we have going on right now, does it? That feels like we might be in those times now. I don't know if we are. It feels like that. And so into that speaks these two men. And here we have Peter and Paul, who tells these people that are going through all of those things I've talked about. He tells these people, and through them he's telling us, not to be anxious. Not to be anxious. And you may say, well, Adam, that sounds great. That sounds great. And I know it's in the Bible, but really, I can't see how that can be done. You may say, I don't understand how I can do this. If I could get rid of my problems, I would. If I could get, if I could straighten out my kid, I would do that. If I could get rid of that chronic pain or that chronic illness, I would. But no matter what I do, that's still there. If I could sort out the government, if I could sort out the school system, I would do that. How, those things are impossible for us to get rid of. So how am I not supposed to worry about them? If I could just shut off the anxiety, believe me, I would do that, you may say. But how do we do that? And how do we not worry? Do we just buckle down and say, well, in verse 6 it says, don't be anxious and don't worry about anything, so I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to worry. Paul says I'm not supposed to worry, so I'm not going to worry. That thing over here that's bothering me, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm going to pretend it's not there. I'm going to, nope, I'm not looking at it. I'm not going to pay attention to it. It's not going to be on my mind. It's not going to weigh on my mind, and I'm not even going to think about it. No, sir, I'm not going to worry. No way, no how. I won't do it. And then you start worrying about not worrying it, right? So then you think, well, am I worrying about that thing? No, I'm not. Now I'm worrying about not worrying. And that actually, people have that problem. People have anxiety about having anxiety. So, and then that becomes this cascade where then they become paralyzed. Is that what Paul's talking about? Just, not worrying about it and pushing it out so that you don't even think about it, like that song, Don't Worry, Be Happy, right? It's a nice sentiment, but it's just not really true. Don't worry, be happy. Well, that's really not what Peter and Paul are saying. Thankfully, they give us some information. But if you want to go out on your own and find out how to not worry, you can do a quick Google search. If you do a quick Google search, you'll find on Goodreads 86 books about how not to worry, about getting rid of your anxiety. Those are the best books. There's apparently a whole bunch of others that aren't so good, but 86 of the best books they'll show you. Good Housekeeping will give you the 15 best books on anxiety according to psychiatrists. You can just Google and the AI will tell you, well, try these 5 things in your life, like breathe differently and do this and be mindful and whatever. So, you don't even have to go to the books now. The AI aspect on Google will list out a few things that you might want to try. And I'm sure there's some good advice in those books. Maybe you'll be able to find some helpful hints in those books. I'm not telling you not to read those books. But if that's the only thing you do, I'll tell you that's not the right answer. That's not the answer. That's a man-made answer, and it's not going to get you through what's going to come in the future, I don't think. So thankfully, Peter and Paul just don't leave us hanging. They don't just leave us with the idea that we shouldn't worry, and then they go off onto something else. Thankfully, they give us a little bit more to work with. So first, Peter tells us in verse 6. Before he tells us, so he tells us don't be anxious. Before he tells us not to be anxious, he tells me the first step I need to do to work towards that, and that's to humble myself. The first step in verse 6 is to humble myself under God's mighty hand. So it says, I'm just going to quickly turn there. I have it written down at the beginning of my notes, but I will get there. Maybe a little easier for me to go back to here. There we go. Okay, I'm just going to go here. 1 Peter verse 6. It says, therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. So what does that mean? So when you read a lot of commentaries, this is what you'll find. A lot of them will say that what Peter is telling them to do is that they need to humble themselves under the chastising hand of God. So what's happening here is God is chastising them, and they need to humble themselves. Now, I don't think that's what's happening here. I think that what this is saying is that we're talking about a protective hand, not a chastising hand, that God has put above them, right? The whole nature of the book of 1 Peter is that these calamities are falling upon the people from the outside. These aren't calamities that they brought upon themselves due to disobedience. These are calamities that are coming upon them because they are obedient. So these people are obedient to God. So if you read through the commentaries, a lot of them will say, well, they need to humble themselves and under the chastising hand of God. That's not what's happening here. Peter is trying to strengthen their resolve and attitude in the face of these trials that are coming upon them because of their obedience to God. So the idea here is that the hand of God here is a shelter from calamities. It's a shelter. Now, that doesn't mean that the calamities aren't coming upon them, but it's the shelter that they have access to. The psalmist in Psalm 91 puts it this way. You can turn to Psalm 91. You don't have to turn to Psalm 91, but Psalm 91, verses 1 and 2, this is what the psalmist says here. It says, "Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." Psalm 18, verse 10 says this, "The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it and are safe." So he's telling you to humble yourself under the protective hand of God. The NIV, if you have an NIV version here, and I like the NIV most of the time, so I'm not trying to run down the NIV, but different translations will give you senses that are better than others from time to time. So sometimes you get, the NIV can say it in a way that's very good, and other times, in this case, I find the NIV reads very poorly here. So if you read 1 Peter here in the NIV, you might think that these two verses are separate, and that's part of the reason they think you get this disconnect about what the mighty hand of God is here. Is it calamity or is it protection? So if you read the NIV, it reads like this, and it reads like these two ideas are not connected. In verse 6, it says, "Humble yourself, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time," period. Verse 7, "Cast all your anxiety upon Him, because He cares for you." So the idea is that it doesn't feel like there's a connection between these two thoughts in that version. But a better version, if you read the New King James or the King James or even the Amplified, and there may be others, but those are the three that I read through, it reads like this. It says, "Humble yourself, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time, having cast," that's the King James, or "casting all your anxieties upon Him." So the two are connected. The two thoughts and ideas are connected in Peter's mind. The first step to dealing with anxiety in your life is to humble yourself before God, And why should that be? Why should we do that? What's the purpose of doing that? Well, one of the reasons, in fact, I think the main reason we have anxiety is because the things that trouble us are out of our control, and we wish to control the situation. We wish to control the situation. Many people have a fear of flying, and if you've talked to some people about their fear of flying, a lot of them will say something along the lines of this. I don't like flying. I never like flying. I don't like the feeling of not being in control. I don't like the feeling of those are the same people that won't let you drive. They want to drive their car or even your car sometimes, but they don't like the feeling of not being in control. And now you might say to them, "Well, wait a minute. Do you know how to fly? Shouldn't you feel better that you are not in control because you have no idea, how to fly? Shouldn't you feel better that someone who has a clue about what all those buttons and levers and flashing lights actually mean? Shouldn't you feel better that person's in charge instead of you, somebody who has a vast amount of knowledge about flying and you don't, but that's not the way people feel. They want to have control of the situation." I was watching a documentary relatively recently, and it was about these big ocean lining ships, and they were coming in. I can't remember what the port was. It was some North Sea port in Scandinavia somewhere, and I guess these are very difficult ports. I don't know. And so you've got this big ocean lining ship that they've taken from somewhere in Canada or Africa or South America, and this this captain has brought the ship all the way to this port. And then you watch that this little boat comes out, this little tiny boat comes chugging out, and they lower a set of staircases, and this guy comes out of the little boat, climbs up the stairs, and heads up to the main what's it called, the brig of the ship, and he takes control of the ship. This person's known as the pilot. This person knows everything about that port. He knows all the intricacies. He knows everything that needs to be done to bring that ship to port safely. The captain, who brought that ship all across the ocean, who you would think would be perfectly capable of handling this ship, hands off all the control to this person who knows exactly what he's doing in that port. And so he has to trust that this person knows what he's doing and is going to bring that ship into port safely. When you repent and are baptized, you are essentially handing the cockpit over to God. So when you decide that you're going to follow God's way of life, you're handing the cockpit over to him. You're saying, okay, God, now I'm submitting to your will. You know better than I do. I have to let you control my life. I have to trust that you know what you're doing and that you are in control of what's best for me. So you're placing your life, just like this captain is placing basically his life in this pilot's hands. You're placing your life in God's hands all the way. Romans verse 8 through Romans 8 verse 28 says this. We all know this scripture. And we all know that all things work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So you're trusting in that all things are working together for good for you. And Paul's talking about things that don't seem like they might be working for good, but you trust that they are. And so anxiety is a result of not fully trusting that God knows what's best for you in your life. A lot of times that's what anxiety is. So the first step is to humble yourself and acknowledge that you are not the best arbiter of what is best for you in your life. You are not the best arbiter of what's best for you in your life. God is. God knows what's best for you. Then you can cast all your anxiety upon him. Because if you don't humble yourself and if you don't trust God, then you might think that you're the best person to decide how to navigate your life. You might need a little help here and there. You might ask God for an assist once in a while. But for the most part, you know what's best for you. But that's not really true. We should acknowledge that God knows what's best for us. And so the things that are happening around us, we can trust that those are happening for our benefit, as Paul says in Romans. So we first have to humble ourselves and realize who's in control and who we're letting take control. So taking that first step of being humble, now Peter says we are to cast all our anxieties upon him. Now what does that mean? How do we do that? Like, what's the process? Like, are we just, in my head I envision, we're walking along and we're just, like it's a Bugs Bunny cartoon, and he's walking through a china shop and he's throwing pieces of china in the air, and somebody's behind catching all these things, walking through behind and catching all our anxieties. Is that what's happening? We're just not paying attention to it. We're just throwing it over our shoulder and letting God deal with it. Well, I don't think that's what Peter's trying to get at. I think first let's acknowledge that there will be circumstances that cause us anxiety. Right? Peter acknowledges that. Peter says you're going to be anxious. This is how you deal with it. How do we deal with it? What are the circumstances that we come to find ourselves in that we would rather not be in that cause us anxiety, and how do we deal with those circumstances? Both Peter and Paul acknowledge that anxiety is a thing, that's something that comes upon us, that in the church we're going to experience these things, that they're not pleasant, that they come into our lives, and so, we have the opportunity to have anxiety and focus on that anxiety. I come from a long line of worriers in my family. Like, my family is, on both sides of my family, I have worriers. My grandfather, the famous story from one of the feasts is that my dad and my uncles went out to get, I think they went out to McDonald's to get some food at the feast, and they took longer than he thought they should. So he went out in his car and started looking in the ditches with his flashlight, because, that's the most reasonable explanation as to why they were like 20 minutes late, is that they must have put their car in the ditch and crashed their car. My grandmother on my dad's side, so that was my mom's father. My grandmother on my dad's side is much the same. If you show up late and it's snowing, somebody must have died, because there's no way you could possibly be late for any other reason. So, I mean, and other people in my family are, like my grandfather had false teeth that probably were twice the size in depth than they were when I knew him, because he ground them so much when he was nervous. You would just see him grinding his teeth because he was worried about something. So, I see that anxiety, and I have anxiety. There's things in my life that I am anxious about. Like my kids go to a secular school, and they're taught secular things. They're taught an ideology that are at odds with my ideology. That's not something that I'm particularly pleased with, and that does cause me anxiety. Like how will I teach them what they're supposed to be taught? Current economic circumstances might make business difficult for me, right? So there's things that in business that might cause me anxiety as well. Who here wasn't anxious? I'm not going to ask you why you were anxious, but there are many people here that were anxious about the election south of the border. Now there's going to be people that are anxious about the election we're about to have, and then there's people that are going to be anxious about the tariffs that may or may not happen, right? Those are anxieties that come from external. I can't say that I don't think about those things, and that doesn't cause me worry once in a while. The Toronto Maple Leafs haven't won a Stanley Cup in my lifetime. Will they ever win a Stanley Cup in my lifetime? Will they win one in my child's lifetime? That keeps me up at night. Serious problems. Well, maybe not serious problems, but there are things that cause me anxiety. One of the things that I personally have anxiety with that pops up from time to time is, when I look at what's going to happen, when I realize the troubles that are going to come in our future, will I be able to measure up like these people did here in the New Testament? Will I have the faith to face the music like these people did, or will I crumble? Right? That causes me stress from time to time. That gives me anxiety, because I'm thinking, look what these people had to go through. This is a type of what we're going to have to go through. Will I be able to face up to that? Will I be able to be the pillar of faith that I would like to be and want to be? Or will I crumble like somebody else might? So those are the things that cause me anxiety from time to time. Now, first, these aren't things that we don't have control over. So what should I do about these things? Like these things that cause me anxiety. These aren't things that I have no control over. I can take some responsibilities in these matters. And if you have the ability to exert some control over these things, you should do that, because there are many good things that you can do that will alleviate your anxiety. I should be a good father. I should instruct my kids in their godly walk. I should let them know what's right and wrong and what God expects of them. Those are the things that I can do to counteract what's happening in society. I should manage my business properly, so that if economic times come that are tough, that I'm working hard and honestly, and working for the people that I work for in good faith. To strengthen my faith, I should pray and study and fast from time to time. I can do those things to become closer to God, so that when tough times do come, that I have that strength that I would like to have when that comes upon me. I mean, I can stop cheering for the Leafs. I'm not going to, but I could, and that would save me a lot of grief. There are things that I can do that may alleviate some of the anxiety, but that's not what they're telling you. So those are good things to do. We should do those things. But Paul steps in here and tells us that the best and most important thing that we can do about the worries in our life, about that anxiety in our life, is to go to God in prayer and supplication. So in Philippians 4, he says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God." So I'm to go to God and talk to him and tell him that these are the things I'm having trouble with. These are the things I'm worried about. These are the things that are causing me anxiety. And specific, we can be specific. It's not just, I'm feeling anxious, God. You can go to him and it says, let him know, let your requests be known to him. With everything, in everything it says. So you can go to him and tell him these things. We can even ask him how we'd like him to intervene. We can ask him how we'd like him to intervene. But the most important thing is that we trust him when he intervenes. Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is not now. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is not what we'd hope it to be. Paul went to God in 2 Corinthians 12. I'm not going to go there, but it talks about 2 Corinthians 12 is where Paul goes to God and says he has this thorn in his flesh. He has this thorn in his flesh. We have no idea what that is. We don't know what that means. But he goes to God with a specific request and asks God to remove that thorn in his flesh. He doesn't say, I just want you to make my life good, God. He says, no, I have this problem. I would like you to deal with it, God. And he asks God 3 times specifically to remove that thorn in his flesh. In this instance, we see that God would not remove the problem. The answer to Paul was no. And even though Paul's answer is in the negative, right? So Paul's answer is in the negative. He wanted the thorn, his request is to have the thorn in the flesh removed. And God says, no, I'm not going to do that. Paul was satisfied with the answer and even happy with the answer because he knew that God was the one who gave him the answer. So whatever the answer was, even though it wasn't what he wanted, he knew that it was the right answer. He knew it was the right answer because what God is doing for him is best for him. So, but that's an example. Paul went specifically to God and asked him about a problem he was having trouble with. Thankfully, we have a God who, when we call on him, will lean down from heaven and listen to us. He's running everything, but he also will lean down and listen to us and listen to what we're talking to him about. He will pay attention. He'll give us full attention. It's not like he's listening to the TV in the corner and listening to us. He's giving us his full attention. And so we can let our requests be known to him. We can let our problems be known to him. Now, we do that through prayer. Why do we have to do that? Why do we do this? Does God need us to tell him what we need? Does God require us to let him know what we need? Matthew 6 says, the Father knows what you need before you ask. He's aware of your needs. So am I saying that God wants us to tell him what we need even though he already knows what we need? Is that a bit redundant? It might sound like it's a bit redundant, but it's not God that needs a reminder. It's not God that forgets. He doesn't. We need a reminder. We need a reminder of something, not a reminder of what we need, but a reminder of where to go, a reminder of where to go for what we need. So first of all, when we go to him in prayer and request something, the first thing it does is it brings our heart to light. So you may think you want something, you may think you need something, you may think your motives are fine, but when you go to God and talk to him about it, you might elucidate something in your own mind or heart about what's going on here. John says in verses in chapter 5, in 1 John 5, verse 14, it says this. 1 John 5, verse 14, it says, "This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask according to his will, we know that we will have what we asked of him." Are the things you're requesting according to his will? Right? Have you ever had a thought in your head that you thought was a good idea that once you verbalized it or talked it out with a friend, didn't seem like such a good idea after you've had a discussion about it? After you've said it out loud, you realize it probably wasn't a good idea after all, that maybe your motive wasn't as great as you thought it was, or maybe the idea wasn't as great as you thought it was. Well, that's what prayer can do for us with God. We talk to God about the things that are giving us trouble, and you hear what you're saying, and you go, well, maybe my motive isn't exactly what it should be. But besides that, and most importantly, when we go to God with those problems, it directs us towards the one that can actually intervene. We have this, I say, facade of control, especially in Western society, because we think we go to the voting booth and we can do some things and we have some control. I mean, up until, I think, representative democracy wasn't a thing till about 1800. 1790 is, I think, when the first representative democracy came into being, I think, in France. Maybe in England, but there's some debate who, the French will tell you they did it first, the English will tell you they did it first. Anyways, but we have this illusion of control a lot of times, whereas these people back here, they knew their sphere of control was basically very limited. The Romans had a substantial amount of control over their lives. They didn't have this illusion that we have of control over politics and laws and governance. They knew that that they had no control over that stuff. So, but we have this illusion, and sometimes it's good for us to go. They also knew that all the things that were happening, whoever was in power, whatever calamity came upon whoever at what time. So like when Israel was taken in captivity, there was no illusion that God wasn't in control of that, right? We have, I think, a bit of an illusion that we're in control of what's happening in our societies more than what's really happening. They knew it was God. And so when we go back and talk to God in this manner and humble ourselves and pray about these things, we are acknowledging, the person who can actually intervene, so that we admit to ourselves that we have total dependence on him, that we have total dependence on him. It reminds us on whom it is that is in charge. It's an acknowledgement of the one who's in ultimate control. That's, I think, the most important thing about going to God in prayer about these things. And then Paul says you do it thankfully. Well, you have all this anxiety that you're going to God with, and we're supposed to be thankful that we go to him with this. Well, the way I understand that and the way I look at that is that we can be thankful that we can go to God, the creator of the universe, who brought us into existence, that we rebelled against. But we be thankful that he wants to have a relationship with him, that we can go to that God, that by his grace, that he has saved us from destruction, and that we can go to that God and leave our troubles in his hands, and that the God who's in control of everything will listen to us. That's the thankfulness we go there with. Not thankful that we have the trouble, but thankful that we can go to him with that trouble. David says this in Psalm 8. Again, it's not something you haven't heard before, but he says in verse 4 of Psalm 8, he says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him?" This is David after he's looking at everything around him. He's like, why? How is it that you pay any attention to us at all? And thankfully, we have a God that will pay attention to us. So, we've gone through a few steps here. Now, what does Paul promise us when we do that? So we've humbled ourselves. Now we've gone to God with prayer and supplication. And now Paul promises us something here. What does he promise us? He promises us that we will receive the peace of God that surpasses all understanding. He says if you go to God in prayer and supplication, you will receive the peace of God that surpasses all understanding. In John 14, verse 27, this is what Jesus has to say. John 14, verse 27, he says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you, not as the world gives it to you, I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." So he says, and so what is this peace? What is this peace that Jesus is leaving with? Because he's like, this is not the type of peace that the world gives you. This is something different. What is this peace? Jesus at his greatest time of stress. So just after what we call the Last Supper, Jesus goes into the garden before he's about to be tried and crucified and beaten. He goes off to pray. In Luke 22, we find what's happening here. Luke 22, verses 41 and 44. Luke is before John. There we go. Luke 22, verses 41. We'll start. And we'll read to 43. Luke 22, 41. So he goes up to pray, and he said, when he came to a place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." That's verse 40. "And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw away, and he knelt down in prayer, saying, Father, if it is your will, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And then an angel appeared to him from heaven and strengthened him. And being in agony, we read verse 44, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. So Jesus was in distress here. You could say he was probably anxious about what was about to happen, right? Because he's asking his Father to let this cup be removed from him. But as you go over the next few hours, so here he's praying to the Father, asking that, is there another way? Is there something else that can be done? Praying for, this cup to be removed, praying for the strength to get through whatever's going to happen. And he looks like he's in incredible distress. He's in incredible distress. But then after this, if you look at his demeanor after this, he goes through the trial, the accusations, the disrespect, the beating, the crucifixion, does he look anxious? Does he seem worried? Is he high-strung? Is he afraid? Is he defensive at all? Do any of those things describe Jesus after this point where he prays to God? No, he looks like he's at complete peace, doesn't he? Well, if you read through all of those things, and if you don't get the idea that Jesus was at peace with everything that was happening at that point in time, that's the impression I get, that he's at complete peace with what's going on there. And the peace that Jesus had at this point in time was that he had complete and total trust in his Father. The peace he had inside him is that he had complete and total trust in his Father. He knew his Father was in control. He knew his Father was in control completely. He knew that those people that thought they were in control weren't really in control. And so he was at peace because he knew what was happening was all part of God's plan. That's the peace he can leave with us. That's the peace he's leaving with us, is that we can have that same peace, that we know that God is in complete control. That's the peace that it goes beyond understanding, because Paul says people won't understand that peace. If you're going through trials that look horrible and terrible and things that people would be anxious about, and you don't look anxious, like if you look like Jesus, it's possible to be like Jesus, but if you had any kind of resemblance to that, they won't understand it. It's the peace that goes beyond understanding. Like, they can understand if you're at peace that everything's going well. They can understand if you're at peace if you have lots of money, if you have a beautiful family that never gives you trouble, you have a job that is fun or exciting. They can understand if you're at peace in those instances. But the peace that goes beyond understanding is this peace that Jesus leaves with his disciples, that even when things are going horribly, you still look like you're at peace. How can we have this complete trust in the Father is a question, right? So how can we have this peace? Because to have this peace, you have to have trust in God, this complete trust. Peter says, casting all your anxieties upon him because he cares for you, right? The reason you can have this peace is because you know he cares for you. You know that he's not there, not paying attention, that he's not there out for your demise. He cares for you. He wants what's best for you. How can we be sure that he cares for us? How can we be sure that he cares for us? Philippians 2, if you go back to Philippians, this is in verse 6 to 8 of Philippians 2, it says this. Philippians 2, verses 6 to 8. Christ Jesus says this. He says, verse 6, it says, Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even the death on the cross. John Lennox says this, and I think this is true. One of the reasons we know that God cares for us is that Jesus voluntarily came into this world of pain and suffering, came into this world filled with anxiety, and became partakers of our suffering along with us. So he just didn't sit off in the distance. He came down and became partakers of our suffering with us. He didn't have to, but he did. He came into this mess that we created and endured the shame and the suffering of the cross. For what reason? What was the reason that he did that? What was the reason that it says he did that for? Hebrews 12 says this. It says it was for the joy that was set before him. So the reason he did that was for the joy that was set before him, that he endured the cross, that he endured that suffering, that he became a partaker in our suffering with us. And what was that joy set before him? Was it the joy of the glory of God? Nope, he had that. Was it the joy of living on for eternity in peaceful bliss with his Father? In a perfect relationship with his Father? Nope, he had that. Was it the joy of obedience to his Father? Was it the joy of perfect trust between him and his Father? They had all of that. Everything was already perfect between them. They were perfect together. They would always be perfect together. They were perfect in the past. They'd be perfect into the future. They were the epitome of love, holiness, and righteousness, right? That's what they were. They had everything. The only thing they didn't have, and he didn't have to prove anything to his Father either. Realize this. It wasn't like he had to say, I'm going to prove to you how good I am. The Father already knew how good Jesus was. The only thing that they didn't have was you and me. We had gone off, created this world of suffering, and the only way for us to bring us back into the fold was for him to come down and partake in that suffering with us. And it's for that joy that he came down and suffered. That's how we know he cares for us. Why else would he do that? Unless he cared for us. You know, I go canoeing from time to time, and people talk about anxiety being like a weight on you, or worry being like a weight on you. I go canoeing from time to time, and you get to the end of a fairly long paddle, and you unload the canoe, and you throw the food barrel on your back, and you put the canoe on your head, and you go for a trudge for 1.5 kilometers through the woods, you know, filled with mosquitoes and bears and whatever else is in there. And you put that on there, and, you know, you get the life jacket dangling in your face. You can't see where you're going. If you're going down a hill, the back of the canoe might hit a rock and bounce you forward, or the front of the canoe might hit a branch and jar you back. You can't really see where you're going, and you're under this tremendous weight that's on top of you. And then you get to the end of that portage, and you just like throw the canoe off and drop the food barrel. And it's like, you know, if you're a 200-pound guy, it feels like you weigh 110 pounds maybe after that. It's like the relief of unloading that weight at the end of a portage is hard to describe. You feel great. I mean, you shouldn't feel great. Everything's kind of sore, but you feel great. You're covered in mosquito bites and whatever. But just getting rid of that weight is just unbelievable. And thankfully, you know, we have a God that we can unload that weight. It's not only like we get to unload that weight at the end of the portage. We can be, you know, partway through our journey and say, this thing's weighing down on me. Do you think I can let you take this for me? And God will say, you betcha. You can load it up on him. He'll take the weight. He'll guide you where you're supposed to go. Proverbs 3 verses 5 and 6 says this. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And in all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. He'll take the weight of that anxiety. And not only that, he'll direct you in the path through that forest there's still bears and mosquitoes and all that around you, but he'll take you on the path that you're supposed to go. He'll take you where you're supposed to go, and he'll take that weight for you. He'll take that weight for you. You don't have to carry that weight on your own. He'll take it for you. That's when Peter says, cast your anxieties upon him, right? Cast your anxieties upon him. Things are going to get more anxious for us. The things that are coming in the future aren't going to necessarily be less anxiety causing, I think. I think we're probably going to have things that cause us more anxiety in the future. And we need to be able to know that we can go to God with those problems and trust him to take care of them. Right? We need to be able to go to him. And in the future, if things get worse, or which I suspect, according to what I read in the Bible, that's going to happen, we need some place to go with that anxiety. And we need to rely on God. We need to go to him, talk to him specifically, tell him the things that are giving us trouble, and then leave it with him. In conclusion, I'm going to combine these two scriptures, verse 6 and 7 of Philippians and verse 6 and 7 of Peter. I'm going to try to meld them to give you one thought. I'm not making new scripture. I'm just paraphrasing so that I think you can get an idea of what Peter and Paul are trying to tell us here. And I'm taking bits from each piece and putting them in different spots, okay? So, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God, casting all your anxieties upon him, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and mind through Christ Jesus, because he cares for you.